So I'm John Philipsborn. I manage a team of climate resilience practitioners at SLR Consulting. I'm also very proud to serve on the board of the SCDRP, which has done a great job so far today. And I have the honor of moderating this session. There are going to be a number of different themes that we're working through on this session, but I'm hopeful that while you follow us, you also kind of come back and see how they're all connected. So this session is called Shelter Before, During, and After Disaster, kind of looking at that spectrum of disaster. But it's also, I think, fair that we could call it or think of it as a conversation on shelter in a changing climate. So again, thinking about that different life cycle of a disaster, but also thinking about that risks aren't static. Things are changing. We've heard a lot about that this morning. So I'm going to try to be very brief on my part. I'm going to set the stage for kind of what we're talking about, and then I'm going to sit back down and pass the mic to my colleagues, and we'll have a discussion and active, and hopefully have a lot of time to engage with you all for some questions and answers. So the first thing I want to set the stage for in terms of context is what we mean by the word shelter. And again, we're going to go down two lanes, which hopefully we bring back together. By shelter, of course, we mean housing, which you can kind of think of in this sense of permanence, but of course we know for so many people housing isn't a permanent thing. But essentially, shelter is where people live. On the other hand, we want to think of shelter in this context of emergency shelter. So where some people need to go during or immediately after an extreme weather event. So those are our two lanes for definition. Why this is an important context or a conversation to have now in an event like this, we heard a lot from the speakers in the previous panel about baseline conditions in different states and territories across the region. We can think of things like demographic shifts, population growth, or in some places population decline. We can think of underlying social vulnerability characteristics that occur. All of these influence kind of that concept of shelter, but also we're here to talk about how disasters are changing across the region, how climate change is increasing stressors. So these two things, this kind of baseline of housing stock, populations, economy, social vulnerability, all of that really influences this conversation of shelter. So too does this concept of changing climate across the region. And that's really what we're going to focus on, is kind of where those two things are converging. So with that said, I want to thank our panelists, and I'm going to introduce them very briefly. Their bio information in full is available elsewhere. But also, they're each going to have a few minutes to speak about themselves. So, not in the order of listed, but in the middle here, we have Gagné, Community Planning and Development Specialist from the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development's Office of Disaster Recovery. On my far left, we have Jesse Spearo, Assistant Director of Miami-Dade County's Department of Emergency Management. And on my immediate left here, we have Reese, Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer at SBP. And so just a quick run of show. Each panelist is going to have a few minutes to introduce themselves and their organization, talk a bit about kind of their work in the context of shelter. And then I'm going to run through a few questions for the panel to talk about as a whole, a few questions for individuals. We'll do a little lightning round, and then again, hopefully have plenty of time to engage everyone here for some Q&A. Take my seat. Hello? Just speak. I'm going to start with Aaron. So Aaron, if you take it away.
Thanks, John. Good morning, all. Aaron Gagné. I hail from Charleston, South Carolina. I'm a recovering planner. I'm actually proud to say that even though 33 years ago I ran my first HUD project as a grad student, I've actually never written a plan. I focus on implementing. I focus on the built environment. I'm interested in policy, I focus on the built environment. I'm interested in economics, I focus on the built environment. And being part of the disaster recovery team at HUD is about, some people talked about they're in their dream job. I'm pretty sure I'm in my dream job because it allows me to knit together everything that brought me to this place, from environmental protection and preservation and engineering to construction to historic preservation to social equity to economics and all of those pieces, focusing on the end product, and that's the implemented built environment. So that's how I got here.
Excellent. Thanks, Aaron. Jesse, can I pass the mic to you?
Hi, good morning, everyone. Jesse Spearo with Miami-Dade County Department of Emergency Management. So this is a brand new department. Really excited to be part of this team. In fact, I've been on the job for about 2.5 months. I don't have any business cards yet. I apologize for that, but hopefully we'll get you that. So I have about 2 decades of emergency management experience in all the phases of emergency management, but a lot of it in the prevention and mitigation side, and that's really what I love and enjoy. But I just want to touch a little bit about Miami-Dade County Department of Emergency Management. On September 30th, it was a department of 26 people. On October 1st, the FTE, our full-time equivalent positions, got moved to 46. So it is very difficult if you work in government to get 1 FTE for your organization, right? We got 20 of them. So that goes to show you that our Mayor Daniela, is committed to emergency management, disaster preparedness, resiliency, and building capacity within our community. She has recognized that this is the tip of the spear with regards to climate change in the United States. So what we're going to be able to do and implement here across this whole community will hopefully serve as a model and a bellwether for all the other jurisdictions across the country. So I appreciate the opportunity to be here. I've worked at all levels of government and private sector and have worked in disaster housing. So that's a little bit about my background, but I'm great to be here. Thank you, Joe.
Thanks so much, Jesse. And Reese, round us out.
My name is Reese May. I'm the Chief Strategy and Innovation Officer for a nonprofit disaster preparedness and recovery organization called the SBP. We started in New Orleans just after Katrina, more correctly, just southeast of New Orleans in St. Bernard Parish. We began as an organization focused on rebuilding homes for low-income survivors who owned their homes, didn't own any other homes, couldn't afford market rate contractors, and desperately needed to get back, urgently even, John, needed to get back to their shelter, the homes that they already owned, the affordable homes where they lived before the disaster. In doing that work in Louisiana, we had occasion to meet Toyota, who helped us learn to build homes the way they build houses. It was a super heady time. I had been a United States Marine and did a couple tours in Iraq and had studied philosophy at the graduate level, and I dropped out to go to New Orleans for a little while. And I met the couple that had started this group right around the time we met Toyota. We used the Toyota production system to reduce by half the amount of time it took us to build homes for poor people. We began to expand that model, first to Joplin, Missouri, for a lot of folks who had been down and volunteered with us on the Katrina recovery. We built a couple hundred homes in Missouri. I then committed the cardinal sin they don't ever forgive Mississippi men for, and I moved to New York City after Hurricane Sandy. Doubled down and married a woman who's from there, so I'm dead to my family. But I have been able to do this work for a little over 11 years. What I saw in my experience bringing SBP's model to rebuild for LMI populations in communities impacted by disasters more recent than Katrina was a very central role that government plays in the lived experience of poor people. Before, during, after disasters, we rely on government for information, for our built environment and what will be allowed and what won't be allowed, and for those precious and few resources that come to communities after disasters. For me, the importance of this panel is the lived experience of the more than 3,000 people for whom SBP has rebuilt a home. We're a charitable nonprofit organization. If we're rebuilding your house, it seems like a lot of things have already gone wrong for you. And so as an organization a few years ago, we stopped measuring our success by how many homes can we rebuild for the people in the most suffering after disaster, and what should we be doing as an organization to obviate the need for those services year-round before people ever need our rebuilding. And so now we always build, we always have, we always will. We do it affordably and resiliently and sustainably. We do it before and after disasters. We also share our resources, the Toyota production system, our hundreds of AmeriCorps allocations with other organizations in communities impacted by disasters where it may not make sense for SBP to open an operation, but we can surely partner with a Rebuilding Together, a Habitat for Humanity or United Way. We do a ton of preparedness training for individuals, small to medium-sized businesses, government agencies that touch low-income and home-owning populations, because we know when people are prepared in advance of disasters, they're less likely to need the assistance of government or charities afterward. And then the last two of our interventions are the reason I have this awful haircut and matching blue jacket with Aaron. We advise state and local governments that are implementing long-term preparedness and recovery programs. And I also oversee SBP's advocacy agenda, which is focused on easing the federal regulatory environment that will equip state and local operators to mount more successful preparedness and recovery programs. That's a lot. I've been doing this job for a long time. Folks talk about their dream job. My experience of it is really a nightmare. By the time we get there, poor people have been waiting months, sometimes years, on assistance that never materializes, even in places where we knew these disasters were going to happen and where we know they're going to happen again. There's no doubt I'm doing what I should be doing, but I'm thankful for this opportunity today to talk not about my dream job, but about some of the worst of what disasters have attended in the communities where I've worked.
And we don't have to talk about New York here. This is a safe space. So I think Reese set it up really well, talking about kind of the spectrum of pre-disaster, during disaster, post-disaster. And so I want to tee up this first question, and kind of Aaron, we'll start with you again. Thinking about the housing part of shelter specifically, could you tell us a bit more about the part of the disaster life cycle, so again, that pre-disaster, during, or post, that you are most directly involved in? Maybe some additional changes that you might have seen or observed in your work over the recent years.
Thank you. With a little caveat, ran my first HUD project 33 years ago, but I just joined HUD a couple of years ago, so I'm kind of the fox in the hen house. I used to receive a lot of federal grant funds, and now I get to oversee them. What space do we occupy? HUD is a little bit different from some of our federal partners. Most folks are much more familiar with the FEMA model, and that is the response model. That fits into the space of responding to an immediate threat and responding to a threat to life and property caused by a storm event. We come in well after that. So when FEMA and SBA are sort of rolling out, that's when we're rolling in. And admittedly, it probably takes us too long to get there, but I can explain some of why that is. But we come in for the long-term disaster recovery. We come in for the long-term reconstruction. We come in for the repair and, in many cases, replacement of housing. We come in for the reconstruction and replacement of infrastructure and public facilities. Those are longer-term issues, and one of the benefits of that is we're also trying to leverage longer-term decisions and perhaps better decision-making as part of that process. Should a home go back where it was? Is it a repetitive lost property? Is it in a threat area that no amount of engineering or planning is going to get you out of? So do we need to maybe think beyond just elevating it, but maybe get them the heck out of there? Should the city hall or town hall, I worked a project exactly like this, in Colorado at the bottom of a river valley, because the land was free, you had the EMS station, fire station, and town hall and senior center all in one building, right at the bottom of the valley. You can guess what happened when they got 4 inches of rain up the valley. The building was fundamentally gone. The river had carved out the entire property. It was gone. First blush, the town wanted to put it right back. I said, no, let's rethink this. So it's trying to make some better decisions as we move down the road. Some of those decisions, and I think we'll touch on them as we go a little bit, are the how. Some of the decisions are those land use decisions. Some of them are building technologies and building techniques. Some of them are building technologies and building techniques that maybe local codes don't permit today. So it's working with communities to kind of make that judgment, make that assessment, saying, you know what, I understand that this is a new technology for your building officials to look at and to permit, but here's why, and here's how it's tested out. We had a community on the west coast of Florida that fared extraordinarily well through Hurricane Ian, due in large point because they have been living and working with a resilient and hardened building code for 20 years.
Yeah, that's excellent. Jesse, you, as part of emergency management, I think the connection to housing as our part of shelter might not be as directly apparent, but how would you answer that question? Kind of where does your work most directly interact with that kind of housing element?
Thank you. The work as an emergency manager is throughout the whole cycle. And our role as emergency managers in this process is prior to, during, and after. So that's where we operate in all those areas, almost equally as well. In the preparedness phase, it's very busy for us. In fact, it's busier than the rest of the year. In fact, the conversation, when I started in this profession 20 years ago, and I'm in Florida, people say, well, what do you do the 6 months a year it's not hurricane season? Because they didn't think we worked the 6 months a year it wasn't hurricane season. And I tell them, I'm like, that's the busiest time of year for us. We're planning, we're training, we're exercising, working on our mutual aid agreements, we're communicating with the public, we're doing all sorts of things. When it's hurricane season, we're focused on the tropics and what could be the impacts. But during the preparedness phase, not only are we developing plans, we're conducting exercises, we're training our personnel, we're working on MOA, MOU agreements, memorandums of understanding. We're assessing our sites, our schools. We're making sure that they are resilient, they're appropriate enough to withstand the impacts from these threats. Then also we have to train all sorts of staff across the county and volunteers to staff these shelters because we don't have enough staff internally here to do that at emergency management. We have about 130,000 shelter spaces available in Miami-Dade County. It may seem like a lot. We're at a shelter deficit. It should be double that. So we can get it scaled up to about 160, but that's still not enough. So there's a lot we're doing in that preparedness phase. During the actual response phase, we've got all these teams deployed out there. We are remaining in contact with them. We want to make sure that their operations are safe, there's enough security, their logistics are met, they're not having power outages, and then also how we can get them transitioned out of there. The most important thing as a shelter manager is to ensure that everyone that goes in that shelter, everyone is able to leave afterwards. You don't have a decrease in the number of people that are there. When I was emergency manager in West Florida, in Southwest Florida, in Cape Coral over in Lee County, for Hurricane Irma, we actually had our numbers change. So the shelter that was in our city, we were at a capacity about 1,200 over what our total was supposed to be, but we didn't have any losses. We actually had a gain. We had a birth inside the shelter. So it was a +1, so that's a win for us to be able to get through that. So we were happy with that. But then in that last phase, that's also a very busy, long, drawn-out process we go through. It's what I call the ETIP. It's the emergency shelter, it is the transitional shelter, it is the interim housing, and then the permanent housing. We help to facilitate that whole process for everybody between our building departments, our transportation, our humanitarian agencies that help support us. We want to get people back in some type of home that they can get to work and they get their kids back in school. So that's our involvement in that process.
That's great. That's great. Reese, I want to stick with the topic on housing and kind of ask you a slightly different question. So you've expressed some of your experience and across life cycle. What would you say is the baseline condition with regards to the current housing stock? Again, you've worked in a number of different cities that you think is really driving some of the exacerbated challenges that we're seeing in the region, again, as it relates to extreme weather events and changing climate.
Sure. For me, the biggest challenge when I look around, particularly the Southeast, is like the way the Southeast was developed. It's often along riverfronts where low-lying areas that often flood were the cheapest or even worse, the only land that was available for poor people and black and brown communities to build on and live in. As these communities experience more significant rainfall, intensifying and more frequent disaster events, it only stands to reason that where things are already bad, they'll get worse. I think it was Haley Barbour who used to say good gets better and bad gets worse. And for communities that are already facing frontline experience of climate change and the impact of more frequent events, that's going to get worse. And so to me, one of the biggest challenges we're facing is, to Aaron's point, what are we going to do about that? We can't elevate every structure and you can't rebuild it 200 times. It's also difficult to inspire wholesale change where you carve out the top of a mountain in Kentucky and move an entire community there. But for me, what will be important in advancing equity as we see more and more investment go to preparing communities is paying particular attention to how the riskiest places and populations became that way, because it wasn't accidental, nor should the investment that's supposed to guide its correction be accidental, but very deliberate.
That's great. We'll come back to some of those points, I'm sure. I want to open up to the topic of emergency shelters and kind of focus a bit more on that. And Jesse, you started talking a bit about this. I'm going to bring you back to it. So housing has a direct link to emergency shelters. Example, the less permanent, resilient housing people have, of course, the more needs there are for emergency shelters during an event and after events. Shelters, though, as you've explained and experienced, they also exist and they're managed independent of housing. So I was hoping, kind of following up on some of the things you were just saying, talk about a recent challenge that you have seen with the approach to emergency shelters in a changing climate.
That would probably have to be directly a result of the increase of frequency and intensity of these hazards, these storms. So these storms are not your typical run-of-the-mill storms anymore. We're looking at category 3, 4, 5, massive impact zones, huge, huge storms. And we have a more resilient building stock today here in Florida because of an event that took place here in Miami-Dade County a couple years ago in 1992. Hurricane Andrew was a watershed moment for emergency management as well as for how we build and design homes and communities. So we have the Miami-Dade building standard for design, and the homes that are built after 1992 that have adopted that building code, those are the more resilient homes. They can withstand those wind impacts. But they can't withstand the impacts of surge, which is becoming a big issue as well. Or a lot of the flooding that we see with surface flooding of streets. So how do we look at this? Well, we don't want to have these populations end up in shelters. We want to keep them in their homes. So obviously, the solution for this is very clear: increase building codes. However, there's a pushback from industry and business on that because it costs more money to build these homes that are more resilient, and they pass that off to the home buyers on that, and that's a difficult swallow for a lot of people to do if they have to spend an extra $10, $20, $30, or $40,000 for homes. It's actually not that much. To build code or code plus is actually a very marginal amount when you look at it, and the savings you get out of that is phenomenal. So we want to try to encourage our partners in the private sector and businesses and community designs to do smart build design in which you're building at code plus. You're looking at elevations, your base elevations, you're increasing that up from what it is to something that is higher in the future. That will absolutely prevent people from losing their properties, ending up in shelters and transitional housing, which has greater impacts across society. In Southwest Florida, around the Lee County, Charlotte County area, there's a community that was built a couple years ago. It's called Babcock Ranch. Is anybody familiar with that? By show of hands? It is America's first solar city. They had the Hurricane Irma with its near category, not Irma? Ian, I'm sorry. They all run together after a while. It's just a big stew of hurricanes in my head. So Ian spent about 8 to 10 hours over that community in Southwest Florida. They didn't lose power once. Not a single house had any damage besides superficial from landscaping. Completely redundant power system that's there. It survived. That is a smart design city at Code Plus that is resilient, that is ready for the hazards of not today, not tomorrow, but 10 and 20 years down the road. That's what we should be looking at, because if we design smart now, we don't have to spend more money and potentially lose lives and property in the future when we have to move people into transitional housing.
Yeah. No, those are good thoughts. Aaron, I'm going to give you an opportunity to add on a bit to the concept of emergency shelters and maybe offer up any changes that you think are necessary or possible. And we'll touch back on this, but in case there's any follow-up yet to what Jesse said.
Yeah, and I think Jesse's example was perfect as a community that doesn't need a shelter. It's already a hardened community.
In fact, they actually had a space available that they had other people from the county and community go to there as a shelter, but nobody that lived there needed it, so they had space available that they accepted the community into.
Now, is that possible everywhere? Sure, anything's possible. Anything's possible with enough money and enough time. Is it practical? Probably not. And retrofitting communities is something that's particularly tricky and particularly difficult. But I'm working with a community actually in Puerto Rico, who as we know has been just stomped on by multiple storms, and they have a weak infrastructure grid to begin with. So the challenges are many. But working with a community that really wanted to form a shelter, wanted to design back and build back a shelter, identified a very large community building to do, and they came to us and said, well, we're going to put a hardened roof and hardened windows on it. And my response to them was, that's not enough. You need a hardened roof, you need hardened windows, you need emergency access to the building, you need expanded bathroom and sanitation facilities, showers, toilets, all of it. You need backup power that's elevated. You need an expanded kitchen facility. You need all of these things. But these are also pretty basic. Something that comes to mind of, well, where else has those? A high school. It has all those things. An elementary school probably has most of those things. So we look at that shelter model as, what sort of tweaks can be made, what sort of minor investments can be made to change the role of an existing facility and to harden that facility, to make it more resilient and to make it more adaptable. Longer term in that immediate step after the initial shelter in place or community shelter issue, I think across this country we're just starting to contemplate how do we get our arms around excess office space, excess retail space, as our patterns of work, as our demographic patterns change. What do we do with these things? Well, that office building wasn't built to a residential code. No, it wasn't. It was probably built to a higher code. It's probably sprinklered. It probably has higher levels of HVAC systems in it. So what do we have to do to convert this thing? The building code officials will probably give you a little bit of a blank stare and say, well, you can't. It's a commercial. But yeah, you can. Yeah, you can. You just can't accept no at the outset. You have to kind of do that assessment of what's my need, where is my need, because your shelter can't be 20 miles away from your target population, and then how do we get there?
I like one takeaway is when government officials tell us to not take no at first response. Yeah, that's good. Jesse, I want to just do a quick follow-up on your example of the Babcock Ranch.
Yes.
And it made me think that such an important element is communication. And of course, it's one thing to communicate with one's own population about where to go during a storm, but to then broadcast more like regional. And I was just curious if through that example, clearly people from surrounding neighborhoods knew to go there. And I was wondering if you just anecdotally or you just know like they were communicating across the region to...
They were communicating across the region. And in fact, I can go back to when I was a municipal emergency manager in the city in Lee County. For Hurricane Irma, we ran out of shelter space literally within a day. A day. If you remember Hurricane Irma, the entire state was on the move because we didn't know where it was going to hit. This is a monster coming in. It's going to be bad. So everybody is moving. Shelter space in Southwest Florida was completely full up and down from Hillsborough County all the way down through Collier County where Naples is. And this is 3 or 4 days prior to the actual impact. So as the city's emergency manager, as the EOC manager and unified command, we have to make some sharp decisions. What we ended up doing is we made snap decisions to open up refuge of last resort. If there's an emergency manager that's in the room that's ever had to pull that trigger before, that is a broken arrow scenario when you're getting to that, which basically goes, we are commandeering and taking over the space, and somehow it got leaked out to the media, and before we were even able to get it set up, there was a line out the door and it was full of people for 2 sites.
Yeah.
So here we are about 18 hours prior to impact of tropical storm force winds. We're starting to feel the bands come on. It's starting to get wet. It's looking pretty ugly outside. So we still have people waiting to get in the shelters. There's nowhere for them to go. So I have law enforcement, I have fire rescue, EMS calling me up at the EOC saying, what are we supposed to do? So what I did is I picked up the phone. I already knew we didn't have any capacity in Southwest Florida. I call up my partners over in Palm Beach County, which is 2.5 hours away, directly east across the state. I said, do you have shelter space available? They said, we have shelter space available. I said, okay, I'm going to send people to you. And they said, what? I said, I have nowhere to send these people. And this is the last case scenario. So we ended up pushing, and there was a few hundred or so that ended up making that 2.5 hour trek. But that's not a safe message that I want to convene to the public is, hey, go 2.5 hours to the east. I hope that you don't run out of gas. But with the scenario with Hurricane Ian, they were able to communicate and educate the public ahead of time as to where these shelters are. They worked with our media partners, which are excellent partners to have in the preparedness, response, and recovery phases, and they got that message out to the public.
Now, that's a great example, and I think about it also in the context of what Aaron, you were saying in terms of kind of where new or different shelters need to be, and they maybe not be able to exist everywhere, but if they can serve a broader population, how can, cross-government work, cross-jurisdiction work towards having those places that work for a greater audience. I'm going to change topics a bit. Reese, I'm going to start with you on this. So SCDRP, as I hope everyone here has learned, is an organization that is all about partnership. Partnership across sectors, partnership across geographical, local, state, region, territories, Greater Caribbean. On the topic of shelter, maybe you could give an example from your experience of where partnerships, and if you can across sectors, is working.
Sure. I'll give an example. Maybe one from here in Florida. After Hurricane Michael, I requested successfully for the first time, and I got a whole bunch of data from FEMA, a bunch of individual household level data. And in that data, I was able to see FEMA verified loss amounts. It's a big problem for SPP clients. The amount of money that FEMA verifies as having been lost or damage having been done at a property after disasters. So I got a few thousand files from a couple counties in the panhandle of Florida after Hurricane Michael. I worked with industry partners in the insurance and technology space to obtain gray sky imagery of the exact same 2,000 properties, so the day of the storm, the day after the storm. And using FEMA verified loss amounts, I was able to pair up visual gray sky imagery, and you could see where folks got $700 worth of FEMA verified loss, but the roof to their home was gone. Or they got $6,000 in FEMA verified loss, but there was no structure existing there anymore, which asked some serious questions about how we're verifying and justifying FEMA verified loss amounts in this country. But the partnership was able to obtain that third-party data, come up with some compelling visual images showing where people likely under-awarded, and then we worked with local county officials to have FEMA go out and re-inspect a handful of properties, 7 in particular. 6 of those received additional assistance. A couple went from a $1,000 award to a maximum grant of $37,000. Imagine the difference in the life of that elderly family who was living in a single wide trailer that was completely destroyed, and they got $1,000 for their efforts. It took no money no work, no savings of effort on, or savings or terrible effort on my end. I got a few young staff members together to look at the imagery, pair it up with FEMA verified loss amounts, and then talk to the folks we knew in that community. This is an opportunity to get folks out of emergency shelters, Jesse, back into the homes that they the affordable homes that they already own. But the real trick is accessing the assistance from FEMA that's supposed to be available for people who find themselves in these scenarios. And so a way that we've partnered with communities here in Florida and hopefully in North Carolina and South Carolina and tons of other places in the future is ensuring that survivors are actually getting what they're due from FEMA, or that they're receiving appropriate compensation for the actual damages they've experienced, which all too often they just don't get.
That's great. Aaron and
I'd like to jump on that for to amplify a couple of points. Who are our clients and how you design your program? And when I say design your program, I don't actually care where your money's coming from, whether it's from a nonprofit or a state or a county or the federal government. But firstly, who are our clients? Look, HUD is all about assisting those people of low and moderate income who need assistance. Low and moderate income populations in neighborhoods tend to be the most at-risk neighborhoods in the times of storms. They also are most likely to be the least likely to self-recover. So they don't have assets, they don't have insurance, or limited on both fronts. So these are entire neighborhoods, these are communities, and I would say capital C communities, who can be wiped out by an event. So frankly, we have a tremendous responsibility for that. Program design, and I'm gonna call out my favorite state, state of South Carolina, and the South Carolina Office of Resilience. In their programs, from the unnamed storms of 15 to Hurricane Michael in 16, and on, designed an incredibly streamlined, laser-focused program that puts people back into safe, sanitary, and secure, those are kind of big HUD buzzwords, and better housing. So that elderly couple that may have had their single wide replaced as part of the program may have also gotten an ADA compliant ramp and expanded doorways and a walk-in shower or a roll-in shower as part of that housing replacement. You know, that housing replacement, you know, might have been overoccupied, might have had too many people in too few bedrooms. Well, guess what? Then it's going to go back as a bigger unit. So it's safe, it's sanitary, it's secure, and it's improved. And it's a more resilient house, and it's literally, it's turning over the keys, debt-free. I mean, you want to talk about a generational impact, and a lot of times breaking a cycle. And preserving a community, and just across the board. But a lot of that comes down to program design, and making it a very, very intentional decision.
that's very good. I was going to ask Jesse if you had a partnership example, but I think in the sake of time, I'm going to throw you a tough curveball here. Uh-oh. I said curveball, and the
You
clock
said for the
just-
sake of time, and the clock disappeared.
And here I was thinking the trigger word was curveball, but time makes more sense. So Jesse, you're our municipal representative up here. The topic of insurance is beyond what anyone can cover in one panel, one conference. It's the unenviable job of having to answer this one for us. If you could maybe help us, think through what are some of the current challenges with homeowners and or flood insurance that are, some of these baseline influences affecting this discussion of shelter in a changing climate. And you don't have to stand, you don't have to rant, ease it in, just a few thoughts.
Well, John, I don't think we have time for this today. These fine people want to have lunch at some part. You know, we're the only ones holding them back right now from lunch. But this is a topic that is a challenge for all of us, not just in the public safety space, in the government space, private sector space, but as homeowners. And I'll give you an anecdote to that as well, as I am a victim of that as well. After Hurricane Irma, my insurance company decided to drop me. I was paying a rate of about $1,200 a year, and then the only insurance I could get was from the state through the Citizens program, and it was $4,600 a year. After having them for a year, they came out and said, we're going to drop you. I got a Dear John letter that said, we're going to drop you because your roof is too old and you have a trampoline. I go, well, we don't really need the trampoline anymore, and we get rid of that. In fact, actually, we are having our roof replaced next week, and it's going to be a metal roof, and it's also going to be fire resistant. So, boom, we got that. We sent them the information, and afterwards they said, no, we're still going to drop you. So then I had no insurance whatsoever. So that was a challenge that I had to go through, and I had similar stories from my peers as well. Homeowners insurance in Florida and coastal areas in our Caribbean is a big challenge for us because the threats and the vulnerabilities are there, and it's obvious. But when we're looking at the totality of what, let's say, the flood insurance program in the United States, it's in debt. It has been for a long time. In my opinion, as a humble practitioner in this space, I think that regardless of where you are, if you have an insurance policy or a mortgage, you should have a flood insurance policy through an FPI. The reason I say that is because then it's helping to support the entire system. Now, if you no longer have a mortgage and you want to make sure that you don't have to pay anything, I really hope that you're educated and understand the consequences to that if you do get flooding. Now, those that have flood insurance have tens of thousands of dollars more payout on average than those that don't have any flood insurance. So the average price, I believe, for a flood insurance policy is about $700. So it's fairly reasonable in the grand scheme of things. But just from Hurricane Ian alone, I believe that there's been $2.2 billion paid out in flood insurance claims just for this last storm with Ian. So that's a lot.
That is a lot. Aaron or Reese?
Yeah, if I could jump in there. We talk about the National Flood Insurance Program. Some folks here are no doubt familiar with Risk Rating 2.0, the new kind of hazy, kind of confusing pricing mechanism that FEMA's using to describe what you'll pay in flood insurance premium. That, to my earlier point about how and where communities were developed and who tends to live in low-lying areas, the Risk Rating 2.0 is going to visit a drastic premium increase on the places that can least afford to pay it. Does that make sense? So FEMA's going to make it more expensive for poor people to insure the properties that are at risk through no fault of their own. That is going to widen what is already a pretty big problem in our country, and that's the ceiling of affordability in LMI communities and the floor of the cost of flood insurance through the country's National Flood Insurance Program. There is a wide and widening chasm between those two. More products are needed, more innovation. Some of that's happening here in Florida with things like parametric insurance policies that may command less in premium to provide a more paltry amount of assistance but quicker after disasters. But make no mistake, as Risk Rating 2.0 is fully implemented and rates increase, not in a capped way, but all the way to actuary risk, is going to be bad for people everywhere. It's going to be worse for poor people in low-lying areas, particularly in our part of the world.
Aaron, now's your chance. And you don't have to.
Take the blue pill.
Come on,
Blue
the water's
pill
fine.
Yeah. For all the reasons that we talked about, for all the reasons about the communities least likely to be able to afford, for all of the reasons that also include someone who's received assistance, someone who had a home reconstructed, we actually have in our regulations that they're required to maintain flood insurance. If they can barely put food on a table and pay property taxes, who on earth am I to say, oh, and sign up for this insurance and write that check every year? You know, or more to the practical side, who's going to enforce that? You know, are people going to go knock on doors? Okay, can I see your paid premium letter? for your homeowner or for your flood insurance. Our regulations don't permit us to fund that insurance over time. On the year the property is turned back to the homeowner, we can pay it as part of our grants, as part of our programs. But we can't prepay it, so we can't do like a 10-year lump because the program, NFIP, can't receive those future funds. So, I mean, we're kind of between a rock and a hard place. And frankly, we're not. Our clients are. And you know, sometimes it's benign neglect. We tell them, yeah, okay, we'll pay it the first year. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But it also comes back to the land use decision.
Yeah.
It's you know, we've got a couple of grant cycles that are out there right now. The dedicated CDBG MIT mitigation. It was a mitigation-specific grant round. Additionally, from 2019 forward, 15% of disaster recovery grants out of HUD is required to be spent on mitigation projects. And a prime candidate for those projects is buyout. Those buyouts are pretty darn generous. Those buyouts are really good. You know, communities can take a look at targeted areas of repetitive loss. They look at it from a perspective of where's the higher value? Is it pre-storm or post-storm? Because in places like that Myrtle Beach area that have had the exponential population growth, property values a couple of years after a storm may be higher than before the storm. Right. And, you know, so people can be paid out at that higher value. If there's a significant differential to being able to keep them in the community, differential in housing cost, that differential can be paid. 100% of moving costs. They can write an incentive into it to keep people in the neighborhood, keep people in the community. So frankly, ain't nobody losing out in a buyout. And then that property is demolished, and that property can turn back into riparian wetland. It typically is held in a land trust. It is absolutely deed restricted of thou shalt not build on it. And then that repetitive loss, that need for Zone AB flood insurance is gone.
Yeah.
And the people are in safe, sanitary, secure, and better housing.
And there's a risk reduction benefit to the community.
Total exposure goes down.
Yeah,
Right.
yeah. I think by touching on buyouts, we've now covered every single important topic that we had hoped to cover. So well done. I'm about to open it up for questions and discussion. One of the, just kind of thinking holistically, you know, the concept of shelter, as we think about it across the spectrum, you see how investment pre-disaster in housing stock and where people live, you know, how that influences how we think about the needs for emergency shelter, how we think about, you know, what happens to people during disaster. As we think about, you know, the changing conditions, we talked a bit about emergency shelters in extreme weather events. We didn't totally touch upon how, you know, you're also needing emergency shelters for new types of extreme weather. You know, think about emergency heat or events, and what do you do with people when it's too hot out? I live outside Atlanta. We had to open up shelters for when it got too cold recently. So thinking about that spectrum, we talked a bit about you know, repurposing buildings and thinking about kind of how we can expand what we mean by emergency shelter, and then how all of that, kind of investing in housing, investing in emergency shelters, how does that help and the benefits in that post-disaster recovery time and kind of shortening that gap. So again, too much to go full into. The four of us will write up a white paper and put this on a flow chart, and we'll send it back out. But before we thank everybody, I just want to open it up. We have some time left, and would love to do some Q&A. I'll stand up so we can see. I had my back to this side. I apologize. So I'm going to go with you first.
Oh,
Too quick. Sorry.
Good morning. Good morning. I'm Brian Johnson. I'm from the British Consulate here in Miami. I work on clean energy and infrastructure for trade investment. My question is actually, I would say, much more relevant to Reese and Aaron, because I think about the city of New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina and the most vulnerable populations in that area, specifically in the areas that had residents living in public housing projects and whatnot, and where they feel very, very strongly and very passionate about where they're from, right? Whether it's in the lower Ninth Ward, the Third Ward, right? And those areas, and those areas, people, even though a lot of them were forced to leave, those odd developments were torn down and whatnot. A lot of folks, came back. Folks still want to come back. They have it tattooed on them, whatnot. Like they're very passionate about it. But how do you, convince folks that, hey, this is, where you're living, it might not make sense, strategically, whatnot. And then also as far as like, how you mentioned risk insurance and whatnot and things of that nature that really do affect those populations in a city like that, in communities like that.
Reese, you want to give it a go?
I'd love to. It's such a fantastic question. The identity of home is just that. It's your identity. It's where you're from. No one can take it away from you. And for my part, I spend less time focused with residents on why you shouldn't live here and more time focused on what the benefits of residents elsewhere might be, right? It's not that if you don't live here, you're not from St. Roch. It's that you might live a better way. You might have a better experience if you weren't living in St. Roch anymore. People live in St. Roch. I built 20 houses there or something in the last few years. We're rebuilding in the Ninth Ward. Where people are from is where people are from. And some far-off dream about a plain in Kansas where no disasters happen and maybe we'll move everybody there. It's like the suggestion.
Tornadoes.
Yeah. It's like the suggestion that the homeless guy gets a bus ticket and moves to Florida if he's cold in New York. From where will the resources come and who will make that plan and how will it be executed? So I think it's a kind of false dichotomy. Can you live here or can you not live here? And it's more about what's the right path ahead. For so many communities like St. Roch and the Lower Nine, it has to do with federal protections and regional protections that can be implemented that will protect places that are known, that are people's community where folks aren't going to move away from. And I think that's probably a bigger, maybe healthier way to look at it.
Good answer. I'm going to move to next question. Good question. Thank you. Can we go over here?
So I guess first a comment is to say that in a conversation about insurance, one of the things that I think is a challenge is that many of the people displaced after these disaster events are actually renters. So I just want to put that out there, that there wasn't really a discussion about what that group of people do. The second is going back to what John indicated at the very end there, which is sort of the layering of events after a disaster. In particular, in the Southeast, we're talking about heat. And this is not necessarily the layering of a heat wave, right? This is just chronic heat and the exposure that happens when people lose power or lose their home. And even it's not just the residents themselves, but it's also the emergency workers who come to help them. So I don't know if you have a moment to make a comment about your thoughts on how to mitigate that.
Could I just brag on a SBP, to your point about renters, SBP builds multifamily stuff before and after disaster, and we set up economic models that maintain affordability for the folks who live in those units forever. We built a 50-unit mixed income development in New Orleans just next to our headquarters on the same city block that we own there at Broad and Toulouse. And on it, we have solar panels on the top that were purchased by the local utility. So someone who should actually be against the implementation of renewable energy made that investment for us. It powers a wall of donated Prius batteries from our friends at Toyota. And after Hurricane Ida visited New Orleans, when most New Orleanians did not have power, our residents were able to take hot showers and enjoy a few hours of air conditioning each day, because we thought when we developed that, what will multifamily, affordable income residents need in the event that this building loses power? And the answer is a little bit of air conditioning to stave off the New Orleans heat.
Jesse, or Aaron, did you want to respond to?
I mean, certainly the multifamily piece is a huge component of what we do at HUD. And it is written in as an eligible activity with all of our disaster recovery grants. Those grants are expected to meet overall unmet housing needs. So as part of a housing needs assessment that occurs post-disaster, if they're showing, not only did we lose 100 units, but we're still in the hole by another 200 units in a community. Well, great. Use our money and build 300 units. And by the way, when you build them back with redundant power and resilient standards and elevated and all of those components. So, I mean, right now there are 4 projects underway in Miami-Dade that are CDBG DR funded multifamily projects. There are 2 that were recently opened, large, like couple hundred units per, up in St. Johns County that were exclusively DR funded. So it's a key to what we do, knowing full well that that is a huge component of the housing need in the housing market.
I would look at this with regards to the multifamily. It's a challenge, and I think that the thoughts here are great. I also would challenge that we look at this through a different paradigm as well when it comes to just sheltering and housing in general. Does anybody remember or recall, by show of hands, Bert the Turtle or Duck and Cover campaigns?
Oh boy.
So I'm sorry, I'm dating people here. But that's the old civil defense. This is World War II, post World War II, Cold War type of civil defense with fallout shelters. We have actually transitioned back 60 plus years to that time. Instead of the nuclear fallout, we are looking at a fallout from climate change, sea level rise, increase in frequency and intensity of severe weather. Push events, factors are leading us to revert back to that. So as you that's just my nugget of knowledge
It's a powerful
as I
analogy.
pull the pin out and roll it down.
That's good.
Is to look at that through that paradigm. Perhaps we need that in the future.
Mark, I'm going to let you have last question.
Thanks. I'm involved in a project where we're looking at climate-induced migration, and we've gone around the country trying to look at that. And one thing that's really struck me is how random things end up dictating where people move after disasters, and where the buses go, the public transportation, which hotels can get FEMA vouchers, and people end up living there and making decisions on, never leave those areas they went to. And it seems like we should be smarter about some of these programs before the disaster. Are there federal programs that are looking at that? I mean, there's no utopian place that's never going to have a disaster, but there have to be better spots to move people and worse spots.
But can I add on to that? Is that also another kind of communications challenge or part communication solution that you just, there is information exists, but it's not getting to those who are about to need it?
I don't think so. I think at the local level, we want to keep people as close to their home base as possible. But if it's a large-scale natural disaster and it's wiped out their home, it's wiped out their business, the school is closed, then obviously they're going to go find their networks. It's going to be a familial network. It'll be a social network, typically, because I'm from Wisconsin. So in the Midwest, people that were from the upper Midwest, they would take the rail down. They'd end up on the southwest part of Florida. People that are on the Michigan side or East Coast, they'd end up going down 95 and the rail flagler all the way down to southeast Florida. So that bifurcation of transportation routes form naturally. The same thing is happening with disasters as well. People are just going by sheer ease. This is where they end up because they might be told or that there might be a societal or familial connection to that community.
I like it. Quick responses, Aaron or Reese?
The first set of houses that we rebuilt in Houston after Hurricane Harvey was in this subdivision in northeast Houston. And the first 3 people I met had 504 phone numbers, and I was confused about why, and I asked. And it's because they all moved to Houston after Katrina, and now their neighborhood was full of water, too. So to your point about it just kind of happens that way.
Yeah. Aaron, last thing?
We're officially at 0 seconds. And I'm going to completely dodge it because that decision process happens well before HUD gets on the scene.
Yeah.
So I genuinely don't know.
We're already soliciting ideas for next year's SCDRP conference. Mark, you've signed up to help with that. So anyway, please everybody help me thank Jesse, Aaron, and Reese for a great conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you all.